Dr. Nathan Reed had spent 12 years learning to read people, the micro-expressions that betrayed hidden emotions, the body language that contradicted spoken words, the subtle patterns of thought that revealed what someone was really thinking beneath the surface they presented to the world. He had spent most of his life learning these patterns and using what he had learned to help his patients. He was a respected psychologist who had dedicated himself to the science of psychology. He'd built his career on understanding the human mind, on helping people navigate their own psychological landscapes. His private practice in Portland had thrived on referrals from satisfied clients who credited him with saving marriages, careers, and sometimes lives. Nathan was good at what he did because he genuinely cared about helping people heal. That compassion, it turned out, was exactly what destroyed him. Tyler Webb had come to Nathan's office on a Tuesday afternoon, concerned about what his family doctor had dismissed as a simple psychological issue. Behavioral inconsistencies caused by headaches that couldn't be relieved with medication. But what he didn't know was that he had a much deeper psychological problem. The young man was 26, well-dressed in the way that came from wealth rather than taste, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never been told no. Their first session revealed what the physician had suspected: clear signs of schizophrenia with paranoid features. Tyler believed people were plotting against him, reading his thoughts, controlling his actions through invisible signals. He'd constructed elaborate theories about conspiracies targeting his family's business empire. Nathan had seen it before. The condition was treatable with proper medication and therapy, but it required the patient to acknowledge they needed help. Tyler, like many in his situation, was convinced everyone else was the problem. "There's nothing wrong with me," Tyler had said during their third session, his eyes carrying that unfocused intensity that Nathan recognized immediately. "Do you think I'm crazy? You're wrong, because I just see what's really happening. You understand what I mean, don't you, Dr. Reed?" Nathan had nodded, maintaining the therapeutic space. "What I understand is that you're experiencing things that feel very real to you. And I want to help you distinguish between what's actually happening and what your mind is creating." Tyler's expression had hardened. "So, you think I'm crazy too?" "I think you have a condition that's treatable. With the right medication and continued therapy?" "No." Tyler had stood abruptly. "I don't need medication. I need someone to confirm that I'm not sick. That's all. Just sign a paper saying I'm fine, and this all goes away." Nathan had remained seated, his voice calm and professional. "I can't do that, Tyler. It would be unethical, and more importantly, it wouldn't help you get better." The young man had left without another word. 2 days later, Marcus Webb appeared at Nathan's office. Tyler's father was everything his son wasn't: controlled, calculating, successful. He wore a suit that cost more than Nathan's monthly rent, and carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades getting his way. "Dr. Reed," Marcus hadn't bothered with pleasantries. "My son tells me you've diagnosed him with schizophrenia." "I can't discuss a patient's diagnosis without their consent, Mr. Webb." "Cut the professional bullshit. Tyler is the only heir to a business empire worth $300 million. He needs to be declared mentally competent, or the board will never accept him taking over when I retire." Marcus had placed a leather portfolio on Nathan's desk. "There's $50,000 in there. Cash. All you need to do is provide documentation stating Tyler has no serious mental health issues." Nathan had felt something cold settle in his chest. This was the moment that defined who he was. The easy path was right there, wrapped in leather and rationalized as helping a family in need. But he knew what it really was. Mr. Webb, your son has a serious condition that requires treatment. If I falsify that diagnosis, I'm not helping him. I'm condemning him to a life where his symptoms will inevitably worsen. I can't do that." Marcus had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "Everyone has a price, Doctor. Maybe 50 isn't enough. Let's say 100,000. It's not about the money." "Then what is it about? Ethics?" The word dripped with contempt. "Ethics don't pay mortgages. They don't build careers. They're just the excuse people use when they're too afraid to do what's necessary." Nathan had stood, his voice quiet but firm. "This meeting is over, Mr. Webb. Tyler needs help, and I'm willing to provide it. But I won't compromise my professional integrity for any amount of money." Marcus had collected his portfolio with deliberate slowness. "I'll give you 24 hours to reconsider. After that, I'll assume you've made your choice." He'd paused at the door. "You should know, Dr. Reed, I protect my family, and people who threaten my family's interests tend to find their lives becoming complicated." Nathan should have reported the bribery attempt, should have documented everything. But he'd been so certain that his ethical stance would be enough, that doing the right thing would protect him. He'd been catastrophically wrong. The accusation came 3 days later. A former patient, one Nathan barely remembered from 2 years ago, filed a complaint with the state licensing board claiming Nathan had made inappropriate sexual advances during therapy sessions. The woman's testimony was detailed, convincing, and completely fabricated, but it was supported by carefully doctored appointment records and text messages that appeared to come from Nathan's phone. The investigation was swift. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning in its consistency. Nathan's protests of innocence were met with the kind of skeptical sympathy reserved for professionals who'd betrayed their sacred trust. His lawyer had been blunt. Fight the charges and risk a lengthy trial with an uncertain outcome, or accept a plea deal that would send him to prison for 18 months. Nathan had fought. He'd believed in the system, in truth, in justice. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty of sexual misconduct and abuse of professional authority. Greystone State Correctional Facility sat in the high desert of eastern Oregon, a sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire that housed 1,100 inmates in conditions designed more for punishment than rehabilitation. Nathan arrived on a Tuesday. He noted the irony, processed through intake with mechanical efficiency, and assigned to C Block. The first thing he noticed was the atmosphere. Not just the physical environment. The institutional gray walls, the smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask human occupancy, the constant ambient noise of men living in confined proximity. It was the psychological weight. The oppressive awareness that every person here had been stripped of autonomy, reduced to numbers and schedules, subjected to the whims of a system that wielded absolute power over every moment of their existence. Nathan had studied institutional psychology. He understood, intellectually, how total institutions functioned. But understanding something academically and experiencing it were entirely different things. His cell was 8 by 10 feet, which he shared with a man named Carlos, who'd been inside for 3 years on drug charges. Carlos was mid-30s, heavily tattooed, and possessed the kind of situational awareness that came from extended incarceration. He'd assessed Nathan with a single glance. "You're the psychologist," Carlos had said. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast. You got framed?" "Yes." "They all say that. But you got that look, like you still think this is all a mistake that'll get fixed." Carlos had shaken his head. "This place don't care about mistakes, Doc. It just cares about control." Nathan had unpacked his minimal belongings, A few books, photos, the basic items allowed to inmates, and tried to process the reality of his situation. 18 months, 547 days, in a place where he had no authority, no professional standing, no defense against whatever came next. He'd thought the hardest part would be the loss of freedom. The inability to practice his profession, to help people, to use his skills for their intended purpose. He'd been wrong about that too. The guards at Greystone operated with the casual cruelty of people who'd long since stopped seeing inmates as fully human. But there was a particular group, 4 men who worked the evening shift, whose brutality went beyond the baseline callousness. They were led by Officer Garrett Vance, a man in his mid-40s with dead eyes and a smile that promised violence. Nathan first encountered them on his 3rd day during the cafeteria lineup. Vance had been walking the line, making comments, asserting dominance through casual verbal abuse. Most inmates kept their eyes down, accepting the humiliation as the cost of getting through the day. Vance had stopped in front of Nathan, studying him with the kind of interest that made Nathan's skin crawl. "You're the shrink." Vance's voice carried that false friendliness that predators used before attacking. "Heard you got caught diddling your patients? That's low, even for in here." Nathan had kept his expression neutral, his voice calm. "That's not what happened." "No?" Vance had leaned closer, his breath carrying the smell of cigarettes and something chemical. "They all say that too. But we got the paperwork, Doc. We know exactly what kind of man you are." Nathan had recognized the dynamic immediately. Vance was establishing dominance, testing how Nathan would respond to provocation. The psychologist in him understood it was a power play, a way of determining where Nathan fell in the prison's hierarchy. "I'm just trying to serve my time quietly," Nathan had said, keeping his tone respectful but not submissive. "That's good. Real good." Vance had smiled wider. "Because we run a tight ship here, Doc, and new fish need to learn their place fast. Otherwise—" He'd let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Over the following days, Nathan observed Vance and his crew, Officers Dixon, Kraus, Mendez, and Torres, operating throughout C Block. They were systematic in their abuse, targeting different inmates with psychological torture that left no visible marks: verbal degradation, arbitrary rule enforcement, strategic humiliation designed to break spirits rather than bodies. The other inmates endured it with the kind of resigned acceptance that came from knowing resistance was futile. Fighting back meant segregation, extended sentences, violence that would be justified as necessary force. The guards held all the power, and they knew it. Nathan watched it all with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years studying human behavior. He saw the patterns, the way Vance selected targets based on perceived weakness, how the crew worked together, backing each other's stories, creating a system where their word was law, regardless of truth. He also saw something else, the psychological tells that revealed their own insecurities. Vance's need for control suggested deep-seated inadequacy. Dixon's cruel humor masked anxiety. Kraus's explosive temper indicated poor emotional regulation. They were broken people who'd found a profession that rewarded their pathologies. Nathan filed these observations away without conscious thought. He'd spent his career analyzing people, and the habit was too ingrained to stop even when his professional life had been destroyed. He didn't yet understand that these observations would become weapons. The incident happened on Nathan's 7th day, during the evening yard time. He'd been walking the perimeter, trying to process his situation, when he'd noticed another inmate, a young man barely out of his teens, being cornered by Vance and Dixon. The kid was crying, pleading, while Vance berated him about some minor infraction. The verbal assault escalated, Vance's voice rising, his body language becoming more aggressive. Dixon was laughing, enjoying the show. Nathan had watched dozens of inmates endure similar treatment over the past week. Had told himself it wasn't his responsibility, wasn't his fight. That keeping his head down and surviving was the only rational choice. But watching that kid's psychological breakdown while Vance inflicted deliberate emotional damage triggered something in Nathan. He'd spent 12 years helping people navigate trauma, teaching them tools to protect their mental health. Watching someone systematically destroy another person's psyche violated everything he'd built his identity around. He'd stepped forward before fully deciding to intervene. Officer Vance. Nathan's voice had been calm, professional. The tone he'd used countless times to de-escalate situations in therapy sessions. Maybe we could handle this differently. The kids clearly overwhelmed. The yard had gone quiet. Inmates stopped their activities. Sensing the shift in dynamics, Vance had turned slowly, his expression showing genuine surprise that someone had dared to challenge him. "Excuse me. I'm just suggesting there might be a more constructive approach," Nathan had continued, his psychologist training overriding his survival instincts. "Escalating the situation isn't—" The baton had hit Nathan's stomach before he'd registered Vance's movement. The air left his lungs in an explosive gasp as he doubled over. Then the blows came rapidly. Kidneys, ribs, back. Each strike calculated to cause maximum pain without breaking bones. Nathan went down, his glasses flying off, his carefully maintained composure shattering under the assault. Through the pain, he heard Vance's voice. "New fish thinks he can tell me how to do my job." Another strike. "Thinks his fancy degree means something in here." Another. "You're nothing, Doc. You're nobody. And you better learn that fast." The beating lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt infinite. When it finally stopped, Nathan lay on the concrete, tasting blood, his entire body screaming in agony. "Take him to medical," Vance said casually. He tripped going up the stairs. As Nathan was dragged away, he caught glimpses of other inmates' faces. Not sympathy. That was too dangerous. Just the hollow recognition of men who'd learned that this was how the world worked inside these walls. In the medical unit, a tired nurse examined him with the kind of efficiency that came from seeing similar injuries daily. "You'll have bruising. Probably some cracked ribs, but nothing's broken." She'd given him ice and pain medication, then added quietly, "Whatever you did to piss off Vance, don't do it again. He doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." That night, lying on his bunk while his body throbbed with pain, Nathan stared at the ceiling and felt something fundamental shift inside him. For 12 years, he'd used his understanding of human psychology to help people heal, to build bridges between their traumatic pasts and healthier futures. He'd believed in empathy, in the therapeutic relationship, in the power of understanding to create positive change. But empathy hadn't saved him from being framed. Understanding hadn't protected him from violence. His professional ethics had been weaponized against him, used to destroy his life while rewarding those who had none. And now he was in a place where his skills meant nothing, where his compassion was a liability, where guards like Vance inflicted psychological torture for entertainment while the system protected them. The realization settled over Nathan like a cold weight. The tools he'd used to help people could be used for something else entirely. Every technique he'd learned to identify trauma responses could identify psychological vulnerabilities. Instead, every method he'd developed to build therapeutic trust could manipulate people into serving his purposes. He'd spent his career teaching people to defend against manipulation. He knew every tactic, every tell, every psychological lever that could be pulled to influence behavior. And Vance had just shown him exactly why he needed to use those tools not to heal, but to destroy. Carlos had noticed the change. "You all right, Doc? You got that look?" Nathan had turned his head, wincing at the pain, and met his cellmate's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was different, colder, more calculated. "Tell me about Vance. I want to know everything." Carlos had been in Greystone long enough to know when someone crossed the line from victim to threat. He saw it in Nathan's eyes that night. Not anger, not fear, but something colder. Calculation. "Vance runs C-Block like his personal kingdom," Carlos explained, keeping his voice low. "Been here 8 years. Works evening shift with his crew. Dixon, Kraus, Mendez, Torres. They all came up together, protect each other. Administration knows what they do, but complaints disappear. Inmates who push back end up in seg or worse." Nathan absorbed every word, his mind already processing patterns. "What about their personal dynamics? How do they interact with each other?" Carlos gave him a sharp look. "Why?" "Because I want to understand them." Over the following days, Nathan observed the guard crew with the focused intensity of someone conducting a clinical study. But this wasn't about diagnosis or treatment. This was about finding psychological pressure points. He noticed that Vance maintained dominance through intimidation, but his authority depended on his crew's loyalty. Dixon craved Vance's approval like a desperate child seeking parental validation. Kraus had anger management issues that Vance exploited for muscle. Mendez was quieter, more calculating, possibly the smartest of the group, but deferential to Vance's leadership. Torres was the weakest link, nervous energy suggesting guilt or fear about their activities. Nathan filed away every observation, every micro-expression, every interaction that revealed the underlying psychology of their relationships. His ribs still ached from the beating, but the pain had become fuel rather than obstacle. Nathan had spent his career teaching people to process trauma healthily. Now he was doing the opposite, weaponizing it, transforming victimization into motivation. The first move was subtle. During a cafeteria interaction, Nathan caught Dixon's eye and held his gaze for just a moment too long. Not aggressive, but analytical. The kind of look a therapist gave when seeing through someone's defenses. Dixon had shifted uncomfortably, the reaction confirming what Nathan suspected. Underneath the cruelty was profound insecurity. Later, Nathan positioned himself near where Vance and Kraus were talking. He didn't acknowledge them, just read his book. While his trained ear picked up their conversation, Kraus was complaining about Vance's decision on some internal matter, his tone carrying resentment. Vance had shut him down with casual dismissal. Not noticing the flash of anger in Kraus's eyes, Nathan catalogued it all. Every crack in their unity, every moment of tension, every psychological vulnerability. The second week, Nathan began implementing his strategy. It started with Dixon. Nathan approached him during yard time, his body language submissive, his voice respectful. "Officer Dixon, can I ask you something?" Dixon had been suspicious immediately. "What?" "I know I messed up intervening with Vance. I was out of line." Nathan had let his voice carry genuine remorse. Not hard, since part of him genuinely regretted the tactical error. I'm used to helping people, and seeing that kid breaking down triggered my training. I didn't mean disrespect." Dixon had studied him, clearly uncertain how to respond to an apology from an inmate. "Yeah, well, you learned your lesson." "I did." Nathan had paused, then added carefully, "You seem different from Vance, though. Less, I don't know, aggressive?" more controlled. It was a simple manipulation, identifying Dixon's desire to be seen as distinct from Vance while simultaneously feeding his ego. Dixon's expression had shifted slightly, showing both pleasure at the compliment and wariness at the flattery. Vance runs things his way. I just do my job. Right? Of course. Nathan had let doubt creep into his tone, the kind of therapeutic technique that encouraged patients to elaborate. It's just, I notice you're usually the one who keeps situations from escalating. Like you're the reasonable one in the group. Dixon had straightened slightly, his chest puffing with unconscious pride. Somebody's got to be the brains. Can't just run on anger all the time. Nathan had nodded thoughtfully and walked away, leaving Dixon with a seed planted. The idea that he was smarter, more controlled, more essential than Vance gave him credit for. With Krause, Nathan used a different approach. He'd observed that Krause's temper flared when he felt undermined or disrespected, so Nathan arranged to be nearby when Vance gave Krause an order in front of other inmates, his tone dismissive. Later, Nathan had positioned himself where Krause could overhear him talking to another inmate. Vance treats Krause like hired muscle, Nathan had said, not loudly, but clearly enough. No respect for someone doing the hard work while Vance takes credit. Krause had glanced over, his jaw tightening. Nathan had met his eyes briefly, then looked away, not submissive, but acknowledging. Like he'd stated an uncomfortable truth, they both recognized. The seed with Krause was resentment, the understanding that his loyalty was being exploited rather than valued. For Torres, Nathan identified the guilt Torres avoided eye contact with inmates more than the others. His body language during their abuse sessions showed discomfort. He was complicit, but not comfortable with it. Nathan approached him during a moment when Torres was alone, processing paperwork. Officer Torres, I wanted to thank you. Torres had looked up, confused. For what? During the yard incident, you pulled Vance back. Just for a second. But I saw it. You kept it from getting worse. It was true. Torres had briefly touched Vance's arm, a gesture so quick Nathan had almost missed it. I know you're part of the crew, but that took humanity. Torres's expression had flickered through several emotions, surprise, discomfort, something that might have been shame. You shouldn't read into things. I'm not. I just notice details. It's what I used to do professionally. Nathan had kept his tone gentle, therapeutic. Must be hard, being part of something when you don't fully agree with the methods. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course I understand. Nathan had started to walk away, then paused. But if you ever want to talk, I'm trained to listen without judgment. That's what therapists do. He'd left Torres staring after him, the seed of conscience now growing in soil that already contained doubt. The genius of Nathan's approach was its subtlety. He wasn't trying to turn the guards against Vance overtly. He was simply adjusting their perceptions, introducing doubts, feeding existing insecurities. Like a therapist might help a patient reframe their thoughts, Nathan was reframing how the crew saw their own dynamics. By the third week, the effects were becoming visible. Dixon started making suggestions during their operations, positioning himself as the strategic thinker. Vance, used to unquestioned authority, initially tolerated it, but soon grew irritated. Nathan watched these interactions, noting when Dixon's face showed wounded pride at being dismissed. Krause's resentment manifested in slower responses to Vance's orders, subtle resistance that built tension. During one confrontation with an inmate, Krause had handled it his way, rather than following Vance's directive. The power struggle was brief, but telling. Vance had backed down rather than escalate, aware that alienating Krause might cost him necessary muscle. Torres became noticeably quieter, his participation in the crew's activities more reluctant. The other guards noticed. Nathan overheard Mendez questioning Torres's commitment, creating additional stress. The crew was fracturing, slowly but inevitably. All Nathan had done was apply pressure to existing fault lines, but his strategy wasn't limited to the guards. Nathan had been observing the other inmates with the same clinical precision. He identified men who'd been brutalized by Vance's crew, whose psychological wounds were fresh and raw, men who carried rage but no direction for it. Nathan began talking to them. Not obviously, not in ways that would draw attention. Just conversations about their experiences, validating their anger, helping them articulate what had been done to them. He used every therapeutic technique he knew, but inverted, not to heal trauma, but to focus it. The thing about systematic abuse, Nathan had explained to a group of inmates during yard time, his voice carrying the authority of expertise, is that it depends on isolation. They make you think you're alone, that everyone else is handling it better. But when you realize others are suffering the same way, when you understand it's not personal but systematic, that changes everything. The men had listened, their expressions shifting as Nathan reframed their individual victimization as collective oppression. The guards depend on you staying divided, Nathan continued. They need you to believe resistance is impossible. But what happens when enough people stop accepting the abuse? When someone says no and doesn't stand alone? He wasn't calling for violence. That would be too obvious, too easy to suppress. Instead, Nathan was doing what he did best, helping people change how they thought about their situation, giving them a different narrative. Within days, small acts of resistance began appearing throughout C-Block. Inmates holding eye contact with guards longer than usual, groups forming in yards, no longer isolating themselves. Nothing overtly defiant, but a shift in atmosphere that the guards couldn't quite identify or address. Vance felt the change. Nathan saw it in how the guards' behavior became more aggressive, more desperate to reassert control. The crew's unity was cracking under pressure, and Vance responded by tightening his grip, which only accelerated the breakdown. The breaking point came during the 4th week. Krause and Dixon had gotten into an argument about handling an inmate. Dixon wanted to file a formal report. Krause preferred their usual method of direct intimidation. The disagreement escalated in front of other inmates, their voices rising. "We do this my way," Krause had growled. "Your way is going to get us investigated," Dixon had shot back. "Some of us think beyond today." Vance had intervened, siding with Krause out of habit rather than logic. Dixon's face had shown pure fury at being overruled publicly. The crew's facade of unity shattered. In that moment, Nathan watched it unfold with cold satisfaction. He'd orchestrated nothing directly, just identified the psychological dynamics and applied precise pressure. The guards had destroyed their own cohesion. That night, Torres came to Nathan's cell during his rounds. His face was drawn, exhausted. "You did this," Torres said quietly. "Somehow, you got in our heads." Nathan looked up from his book, his expression neutral behind his glasses. "I don't know what you mean, officer." "Yes, you do. You're a psychologist. You know exactly what you did." Torres's voice carried defeat rather than anger. "Vance is spiraling. The crew's falling apart. And you just talk to people." "I listen to people," Nathan corrected gently. "I help them understand their situations. That's all. That's everything." Torres was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" "Now?" Nathan set down his book, his voice taking on the cold precision of someone delivering a diagnosis. "Now the administration investigates why C-Block is suddenly unstable. They'll look into why inmates are filing formal complaints, They'll notice patterns in the crew's behavior that suggest systematic abuse. And they'll discover that liability outweighs loyalty to a few guards. Torres had paled. You orchestrated this whole thing. I simply helped people find their voices. Nathan's smile was thin, humorless. Amazing what happens when you empower people to speak truth, isn't it? 2 days later, the State Corrections Oversight Board arrived at Greystone for a surprise inspection. Someone had filed a detailed complaint with specific dates, times, and incidents. A complaint that Torres had submitted anonymously after Nathan had spent weeks helping him process his guilt. The investigation lasted 3 days. Inmates, emboldened by Nathan's psychological groundwork, provided testimony. The crew's fractured unity meant no coordinated defense. Dixon, trying to save himself, confirmed abuse patterns. Krause, furious at Vance for years of disrespect, added details. Torres's documentation was thorough, and damning Mendez, the smart one, had already requested a transfer before the investigation concluded. Officer Garrett Vance and his remaining crew were removed from Greystone State Correctional pending criminal charges. The administration, terrified of liability, moved swiftly to distance themselves from the systematic abuse. Nathan watched them escorted out in civilian clothes, their authority stripped, their dominance shattered. Vance had caught his eye in that final moment, understanding finally dawning about what Nathan had done. The psychologist had said nothing, just adjusted his glasses and returned to his book. That evening, Carlos sat on his bunk, studying Nathan with something between respect and wariness. You changed, Doc. When you first got here, you were all about helping people, empathy, all that professional stuff. Nathan marked his page and looked up. Carlos was right. The man who'd walked into Greystone 5 weeks ago had been a healer, someone who'd built his identity on compassion and ethical practice. That man had believed in the power of empathy to create positive change. That man had been beaten on a concrete yard for trying to help someone. What emerged from that beating was something different. Someone who had realized that the same psychological tools used for healing could be turned into weapons of destruction. The kind, compassionate man was gone, replaced by someone who would unleash the monster within when necessary. You're right, Nathan said quietly. I did change. This place taught me that empathy without power is just vulnerability. That understanding people isn't enough. You have to be willing to use that understanding strategically. You regret it? Nathan thought about that, about the guards who'd lost their jobs and would likely face criminal charges, about the inmates he'd manipulated into serving his agenda, even if it benefited them, about the part of himself he'd deliberately transformed from healer to manipulator. No, he answered honestly. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. The next morning, Nathan was called to the warden's office. He'd expected this, some acknowledgement of his role in exposing the abuse, even if they couldn't officially recognize it. Warden Morrison was a bureaucrat who'd survived decades by avoiding problems. He looked at Nathan with the uncomfortable expression of someone who understood more than he wanted to admit. Dr. Reed, the Oversight Board's investigation has concluded. Officer Vance and his associates are no longer employed here. Morrison paused. Several inmates credited you with encouraging them to come forward. I simply listened to their experiences, Nathan said carefully. Yes, well. Morrison clearly didn't believe that was all, but he also clearly didn't want to examine it too closely. Given your cooperation and your unique skills, we'd like to offer you a position in our mental health services, helping other inmates adjust to incarceration. Nathan almost laughed. They wanted to use his psychological expertise officially now. after he'd already weaponized it unofficially. The irony was perfect. "I'll consider it," Nathan said. Walking back to his cell, Nathan reflected on what he'd become. He'd entered prison as Dr. Nathan Reed, a psychologist who believed in healing and ethical practice. 5 weeks later, he'd proven that the same skills that helped people could destroy them, that empathy could be transformed into manipulation, that understanding human psychology was the most powerful weapon in any environment. The guards thought they controlled the prison through physical force. They'd been wrong. Control came from understanding what people needed, what they feared, what motivated them, and using that knowledge without hesitation or remorse. Nathan had discovered something profound about himself. Given the right circumstances, he could become what he'd spent his career helping people avoid, and he was disturbingly comfortable with that transformation. The man who'd refused to compromise his ethics for $100,000 had learned that ethics were just another tool, valuable when they served you, disposable when they didn't. He'd won. The corrupt guards were gone. The abusive system had been exposed. Justice, after a fashion, had been served. But Nathan understood, with the clear-eyed assessment of someone trained to recognize psychological patterns, that he'd lost something fundamental in the process. The line between healer and manipulator, between helper and destroyer, had dissolved, and he couldn't honestly say he wanted it back. In the end, prison had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had changed him, just not in the way anyone expected. Dr. Nathan Reed would serve his remaining time, probably work in mental health services, eventually return to civilian life. But the man who walked out of Greystone would be fundamentally different from the one who'd walked in. That man would know what Marcus Webb had tried to teach him. Everyone has a price, and ethics are just the excuse people use when they're too afraid to pay it. Nathan had paid the price, and he'd discovered he could afford it after all.